In the middle of class, I get a text from a friend of mine. He's a producer at one of Tokyo's major news stations. He's texting me telling me that Abe had just been assassinated. And this was, when I look back on the timeline, this would have been about 8 minutes after the shots. So he's texting me that Abe had been killed. And he's telling me that, pay attention to the news media, watch how this folds out. And the reason he's sharing this with me is because he knows my interest in the inner workings of how news is disseminated. And, he's giving me this information basically saying, what's going on and how these decisions are being made. And it was clear to the reporters, at least to him, that Abe had been pretty much immediately killed, although his death wasn't recorded as a death until much later in that evening. But what I had told my students, I said, as soon as I got that first text, I'm like, everyone look at your phone right now and wait. Abe has just been shot. Let's see how long this takes. And it took some time, and it took some time, and it took some time. And then finally, everyone's phone started lighting up in the classroom. And it was all coming, through NHK. So NHK is the first organization that was allowed to report.
Good morning to everybody. Thank you for joining us. And our guest, Laurie Wesselhoff. Laurie is a lecturer at KU University, where she teaches and does research in social impact, social change, media, subculture, and metacognitive research analysis. Laurie, so welcome once again, and thank you for joining us. I have been looking forward to this talk about the media in Japan and cannot wait to dive into the topic. And if you don't mind me asking, would you tell us a bit about your work at KU, and then we can transition into today's topic?
Sure, no problem. So as you very nicely just introduced me, I am a lecturer at KU. I've been teaching at KU for 29 years now, first at the Shonan Fujisawa campus. Now I'm at the Hiyoshi campus. Most of the classes that I teach deal with media analysis and social change issues. My main area of interest is sort of big picture social change, looking at how culture and society evolve and change over time. And in that vein, I'm interested in the role that media plays in managing that sort of social change. So that's kind of the heart of what I'm doing there. I'm sure a lot of people have questions about the classes in particular, the students. Most of my students, it depends on the classes, but most of my students tend to be students who are returnee students. So they spent the majority of their lives, well, not always the majority, but a good part of their lives studying abroad, and have come back to Japan. And so they have a more critical or different perspective on issues than traditional Japanese students do. I was thinking that I'm going to talk a bit more broadly sort of about the broadcast media environment in Japan. Since this is my first time on this podcast, I'm kind of covering the history of broadcast media here, structure of the media environment, some of the particular Japanese characteristics, and then focus kind of on former Prime Minister Abe's impact on the current state of media in Japan.
So great. Thank you so very much for doing that.
Yes, definitely. No problem. I wanted to just kind of start thinking about the topic of the role of news. And the reason I wanted to start there is I think that I'm not sure who's actually in the room today. Okay, I can see a list here. But as Westerners, we might have sort of a different or slightly different view of what the role of news is compared to some people in the Japanese environment. But kind of broadly, you could classify the role of news into three categories. Like there's that conception of the role of news being a sort of the neutral observer, not actually taking sides in any sort of political positions. Second role would be the thought of the media acting as sort of a watchdog, kind of watching over what the government is doing, reporting on them. In that case, in the American context, that the thought of the fourth estate role of the media. And then the third role that people often comment on would be the media as a servant of political establishment, sort of a state media type of role. And I think when we talk in the West about the role of media today, we're stuck in between that concept of neutral observer and fourth estate or watchdog role. And depending on what the particular story is, we swing back and forth between which we think it should be prioritized. Japan is a bit unique in this aspect, so that's going to come a little bit later. So anyway, those are the three primary roles that news media plays. And in the case of Japan, Japan has a sort of unique history in comparison, at least to American news media, in terms of the ties between traditional print media and contemporary television broadcast media. So in 1871 was Japan's first daily newspaper. It was the Yokohama Mainichi, which later just became the Mainichi Shimbun. And interestingly, the reasons behind the creation of the Yokohama Mainichi, it was created by the Japanese government. So it was created during that time where the foreign settlement was located here in Yokohama in the Kannai area, and there were lots of social issues, social problems related to having a foreign community here. And this newspaper was created pretty much by the government in order to communicate with the Japanese community about what was actually going on right here in their midst. And because of the government ties with the newspaper, it was acting in that role of a servant of political establishment, so it was voice of the state. And it was right around that same time, 1874, a couple years after the Yokohama Mainichi was established, that Japan underwent a large sort of political reshaping after the Jiominken Indo, the Freedom and People's Rights Movement, Itagaki Taisuke's movement that sought for elected legislature, sort of a democracy movement, looking civil rights and things like that. So this led the Meiji government to establish the Constitution in 1889. And anyway, so through this process, the sort of political upheaval of the time, it was right at the same time that other newspapers began to appear. So in 1874, you get the Yomiuri Shimbun, 1879, Asahi Shimbun. And those two newspapers were created deliberately in opposition to the Yokohama Mainichi. So having only one newspaper as sort of the voice of the government, then you get the Yomiuri and the Asahi to provide slightly different type of content, actually. And there was a lot more entertainment content in both of those, but they were to provide sort of the voice of the people, the voice of the public, and to actually start reporting on what the government was doing. And it was also right around the same time in 1890 that the first Kisha Club, the press club, was created, and the first one was created in the Diet. And I'll be talking about Kisha Club and their role in Japanese media a little bit later. So that's the origins of the newspapers. So you have the Mainichi Shimbun as sort of government voice, Yomiuri, Asahi created as sort of opposition to that. Those roles sort of change over time, but that's the origin story of those three. In the 1910s to 1920s, this would be Taisho period, Japan is transitioning into wartime mode, and that conservative shift created a lot of government opposition towards Asahi newspapers. So it's from this period, and this lasts until today, this sort of taiditsu, what is English? Sort of a standoff between the Japanese government and the Asahi newspaper. And then you enter the wartime period, so you have the censorship period from the 30s into the 40s. And that censorship mechanism that was established by the Japanese government concerning print publication was actually utilized by the American occupation after the war in order to sort of inculcate democratic values and sort of anti-communist sentiment in the public. So basically the American occupation continued on with that sort of censorship program until about, I think it was 1951. And then in 1951, free press finally returns to Japan under, I think it was Article 21 of the Constitution. And 1 year before that was the Japanese Broadcasting Act. And that is actually a sort of a pivotal act in Japanese media history. And I just want to touch on that briefly because some of the points of the Broadcasting Act shaped later during Abe's administration sort of the fear factor in media reporting in Japan. So I just want to read a couple points that are in the broadcast law. So this is talking about basically the roles and responsibilities that public broadcast have. So this is Article 3, number 1, that the broadcasting shall not disturb public security and good morals and manners. Number 2, it shall be politically impartial. Number 3, shall broadcast news without distorting facts. And 4, as regards controversial issues, shall clarify the point of issue from as many angles as possible. It goes on from there to further describe what the social function, I guess, of news media is in Japan. But clearly those 4 points are trying to convey this idea that news should be the neutral observer, that they shouldn't be taking on a watchdog role, that basically, don't report politics from any one perspective or side. You have to kind of stand in the middle and impartially report. But, as we know today, impartiality is a very slippery fish to grab when we're talking about the media. So the broadcast law will probably come back up as I talk about Prime Minister Abe's time. So that's kind of the historical overview of the development of the media industry in Japan. I know it's very, very spotty and brief, but it gives you kind of an idea that from the outset, traditional print media, and then from the 50s on, television broadcast media, has this sort of inherent, why can I not think of the word tairitsu in English? Somebody help me. Tairitsu.
Confrontational or something like that?
That would be great, thank you. A confrontational attitude or stance between the Japanese government and certain branches of the media. And this kind of attempt to codify media's role as a neutral observer within the actual framework of the law. So that's kind of the background of the media history. Moving into kind of the more contemporary structure of and sort of the unique Japanese characteristics of the media environment here, I think one of the key features is the function of press clubs in Japan, so these Kisha Kurabu. And I'm sure everyone in the room is very familiar with Kisha Kurabu and perhaps how they work, but you can't really talk about media in Japan without kind of diving into this area. So for those of you who might not be familiar with what these press clubs are, they've been around, as I mentioned earlier. I think the first one was in 1890. So they've been around since the early years of newspapers in Japan. But it wasn't really until after World War II that their more sort of contemporary function developed. So what they are, it's a system where all of the major government, all of the government ministries, local authorities, police, corporate and industry, etc., they all have these sort of embedded press clubs within their own organization. So each of the major television stations and each of the major newspapers has reporters that are assigned to these specific agencies. And obviously, when you think in terms of what the role of a reporter should be, and that they should have no ties to, well, should is, I guess, my own viewpoint on that. But the concept that reporters should be reporting on government behavior, government abuse and misuse of power, that becomes really difficult to do when you're embedded within those industries and ministries. So basically what happens in these cases is that the function or the purpose of doing this, the pros for it, is that you get these sort of a very fast dissemination of information. You have the press corps sort of already there 24/7. So information is sort of handed out to these press members through press conferences, press releases, etc. And there's also the idea behind that having the press there all the time also opens up those institutions to scrutiny, that they can't really get away with anything if the media is here all the time. But when the media is in your back pocket, just because they're in your pocket or just because they're there doesn't mean that they're actually going to be scrutinizing what's happening. So the negative sides of this and what's actually happening, there's a few different practices that are continually criticized in terms of the role of these Kisha Kurabu. And one of these is this process or practice called Yochi Asagake, which is where the members of the press corps sort of early morning and then late at night are visiting with the heads of all of these, the ministries and the other organizations that they're attached to. So they're doing this to get these sort of one-on-one FaceTime with these individuals. And through that process of, day in, day out, making FaceTime with these people, they're creating interpersonal relationships. And as people in, Western media tend to criticize that, there shouldn't be that sort of overlap between politicians and media. They should be two separate entities. So you have this sort of currying of favor between, the members of the press with the people they're supposed to be covering. And the reason they're doing that is so that they have access to the stories, to the news that's coming out. So the closer you can get to these individuals, the more likely it is that you're going to be, the one given access to this information. There's another practice called Kokuban Kyote, which is blackboard agreements. And through this process, there's a lot of sort of backroom agreements made by the members of the media themselves. So within one of these Kishakurabu, all of the members will decide what information they can report on and what they're going to leave out, or what stories will get covered or won't get covered, who's going to cover what in what order. All of that information is sort of decided by the members of the Kishakurabu. And then the details or the decisions are written up on a blackboard, and that's why they're called the Kokuban Kyote. So the members of the press corps can enter into the room that's assigned for the Kishakurabu and just check on the board what the decisions are that have already been made. So there's not a lot of freedom in terms of individual reporting under this system. It's kind of these informal decision-making process that creates sort of a sameness in media coverage across the board. Another feature of these Kishakurabu that is often criticized is who can be a member. So traditionally, membership was limited only to the top newspapers and top television stations. And this was cutting out any sort of independent media, minor media stations and papers. Magazines have been excluded. Foreign media has been excluded. So it really limits access to especially high-level information, but information across the board in Japan. So information and news stories would have to be filtered down then. So the top news stations and papers would get the information first, report on it first, and then everyone else could report after that. There were some changes made in 2009 to that structure. So it has opened up membership in Kishakurabu or press clubs for some more people, but the process which was installed at that time kind of makes that opening of membership a bit questionable. And what I mean by that is once they slightly opened up membership, they institute a process where all the questions have to be submitted on paper in advance. So if a press conference is being held, any of the minor news media, any questions that they've submitted are sort of put at the bottom of the pile. And often, oops, time runs out, we didn't get to that question. And this process of submitting questions in advance obviously favors the questions asked by the stations that are asking the most favorable questions of the administration, the softball questions. So those get to the top. Answers are prepared in advance. It's not really what we would call investigative journalism. It's, again, this is veering very close to state media. Through that process, there are a couple outcomes that are often talked about in terms, Japan is sort of the example of the most structuralized form of access journalism, meaning you really have to be a member of one of these Kisha clubs in order to get the information. There are other ways, of course, to report on things, but you need the access. So access journalism leads to something called sontaku, or a type of self-censorship. It's a bit broader than what we call self-censorship in Japan, but sontaku implies that the individual media outlets themselves tend to manage and curate the stories and the reporting that they do based on what they think will be least offensive or curry the most favor, depending on what your political affiliation of your press outlet is. So if you're a more right-leaning newspaper, you're going to be publishing stories that are more favorable to the current administration. If you're a more left-leaning news outlet, you are less likely to publish anything very critical because of the possible penalties against you. So if you are seen to be publishing something critical of the government, if we go back to that Broadcast Act, all of those stipulations about media being neutral, basically what's happening right now is that the current administrations, or not just the current one, but former administrations as well, have been looking at media reporting, and if anything is critical of current media, then it's not impartial, and therefore it's not to be allowed. So press memberships, the membership in the Kisha clubs, are pulled by a lot of the press, or they're kind of put in the corner in a timeout box for a while if they've reported something that they shouldn't have reported. So that leads to a lot of self-censorship. The ownership of the individual media outlets are sort of trying to control the reporting or control the journalism within their own company in order to continue these connections between their reporters and the Keisha clubs to maintain their membership. And there's a lot of sort of horizontal integration as well. So that's more of like the vertical form within one media organization. But horizontally, between these organizations, you get a lot of kind of arm twisting and sometimes a bit of hair pulling as well, and between the different newspapers or television outlets in terms of what should and should not be reported. So a lot of the newspapers are sort of pitted against each other to try and make sure everyone toes the line. And there's also a lot of claims about the unethical nature of a lot of sort of parties that are held between the Keisha clubs and the government agencies that they're charged with reporting on. So the Boninkai and the Sobetskai and all of that are held. In the U.S. they have the press dinner yearly, and that's always something that's criticized. Whether the president comes and they roast the president, and that's a one-off per year. But these parties in Japan are like all over the place and all the time. So that's another often focused on issue. So that's the basic structure of the Keisha Club. There's a lot more going on there, but with that in mind, I want to move on to talk a little bit about what happened under Abe's administration in terms of these, how he used Keisha Club and sort of the shift in media environment. And I know I'm getting already really close to 30 minutes and I'm like nowhere near through what I'm going to talk about. Okay, I'll try and speed this up a little bit. With Abe's first term, it was only, in 2 years, 2006 to 7. From the 70s, I'm jumping back a little bit. From the 70s, Japan sort of shifting right. You get this role of, Yakuza and Uyoku influence in conservative politics. And within that environment, and that continues on for quite a while. But in 2006 and 7, during Abe's first term, there were a couple of political scandals that basically ended up leading to Abe's resignation. And while none of those are necessarily important or interesting for me, I think in my mind, and what's often talked about is the media coverage of those scandals at the time was pretty critical. And it was the media coverage and Abe's inability to sort of escape that coverage that left a very sour taste in his mouth, apparently, so that when he returned in 2012, he kind of returned with a vengeance and sort of a vendetta against the media. And right away from the very start in 2012, when he enters office, there's this sort of flurry of movement in his policies towards the media. The communications secretary at the time, what was the name? Takaichi. She's quoted as having said that the government has the power to legally shut down television broadcasters who are seen as being politically biased. So she's basically like, not only did the government, or particularly the LDP, create this broadcast law saying that television stations or news reporting has to be impartial, so they're creating the law. They're also the ones to determine who is not following the law, and then this is adding on a penalty to it, and it's adding on the threat of jail time. So this was seen as a big sort of threat to the media industry. And then in the following year, in 2013, the state secrecy law goes into effect, and that actually creates specific jail time. So 10 years possible jail time for whistleblowers and 5 years jail time for media, for reporters, if they're found to have reported something that could be considered a state secret. And of course, as a lot of these types of laws go, what is considered okay to report and not report, what are state secrets, is really incredibly vague. So with a clear threat by the administration that if you don't toe the line, if you're not, if you're report negatively, there is this jail time hanging over your head. That really sends a chill through the media industry in Japan. It was also at the same time, 2013, that Abe appointed Mori as the head of NHK. And this is a guy who's very conservative, had absolutely no media background at all. And he made a statement, and this is regarding the media's, NHK's coverage of the 3/11, or the earthquake, the Fukushima nuclear power incident. And basically he insisted that all news coverage at NHK be based on official government reporting. which is completely saying that NHK will now be the voice of the state. We're not actually going to do any investigative journalism. We are going to report as the state provides the information to us. So, of course, that's, a huge red flag for media freedom. Oddly enough, well, maybe not oddly, this state secrecy law was quite well applauded by the United States ambassador at the time, Kennedy. I guess not terribly important, but it's at this time that then there's quite a lot of attacks focused towards Asahi newspaper's coverage of the comfort women issue and lots of other things going on. I'm trying to talk really fast now, but what's interesting to me of course, Asahi is going to cover these issues in the way that they see those issues. And what's interesting is that Abe worked behind the scenes to get Yomiuri and Sankei Shimbun to both sort of pile up or gang up on Asahi, and it created this huge sort of media spat at the time about Asahi's sourcing of some of the news stories related to the comfort women. But the funny thing is that both Yomiuri and Sankei actually use the same sources in their reporting. So it was, it doesn't matter what our sources are, but you use the wrong sources, and there was a lot of media infighting at that time. And this kind of continues on. I'm going to skip over a bunch of things here, but kind of similar to a lot of like American and British tendencies in media around the same time, Abe sort of begins to eliminate a lot of the larger press briefings, aiming to use more smaller gatherings. And he does a lot of one-on-one meetings and dinners with media ownership and executives. And I think in the first 2 years of his second term, he met with media ownership more than 40 times for meals. So that's a pretty big investment of his time with media ownership. So what was going on behind the scenes? And basically, Abe is speaking in the ear of all of Japan's media ownership, explaining what government policy is, where the lines are, what can be reported and what shouldn't, and how it should be. And in that process, there were comments made about a few particular newscasters. So in 2015, you get this really quick series of firings of some of Japan's top television newscasters. Asahi News, NHK, TBS, all lost some of their major newscasters, as well as a couple producers at this time. And this was all at Abe's request. So this is creating sort of a divide between Japanese news ownership, media ownership, and the actual reporters themselves. So the ownership isn't standing up for the reporters. The government is criticizing reporting that's negative. The owners of the media, instead of standing up for journalistic integrity, are just firing their employees. So it's kind of Abe's divide and conquer strategy, pitting these media organizations against each other. And in terms of like foreign coverage, there was a lot of sort of preemptive bashing of foreign media, saying that, I shouldn't use the word bashing here, but preemptive sort of negating of foreign news coverage by saying that they would be using Japan bashing. Anything that was negative about Japan was Japan bashing. And again, within the same period, it was in 2016 that Reporters Without Borders sent a UN special envoy to Special Rapporteur, Freedom of Press, to Japan. And the initial meeting that was scheduled was canceled by the Japanese government. And finally, they several months later, allowed this guy to come to Japan, but they wouldn't send any high-level ministry people to meet with him. And he ended up with just like this really short 15-minute with some low-level, low-ranking member of the ministry. And the report that came out dropped Japanese press freedom to 72 out of 180 countries. So this is really, really low. This is, I forget what that would have put them between, but it was quite low down on the totem pole for such an advanced democracy. So right now in 2022, Japan's now at number 71. So Haiti and Kenya and Ecuador are all above Japan in terms of press freedom. Not really a good sign for the state of Japanese press. After this period, then in the following year in 2017 was when all of the two bigger Abe scandals, the Moritomo scandal and the Kake, the vet school scandal, come out. His press ratings dropped from 60 to almost 26% that year. And the next year, more scandals related to the Moritomo doctoring of data, etc. And it's at this time that Asahi really starts to push back. So you get this sudden burst of energy from 2017 or so, with Asahi really asserting their role as watchdog, and they're bringing along with them Mainichi Shimbun, Tokyo Shimbun. Those three are all sort of standing up more and more, and even more today, against the government. And pitted against them are the Sankei, the Yomiuri, and the Nikkei. So you have this clear, kind of these two big blocks in the media environment today that are not playing very nicely with each other. And the government tends to use that to their advantage when they're able to. Post-Abe era, the choice of Suga, that, he was the sort of the public face of Abe's administration. So not much change there. There are a lot of incidents of, his very outright anger at reporters about the questions they were asking. And into today with, Kishida again, there's not terribly much change in terms of how the media is being used by the government. Okay. Yikes. I think we're kind of at time here, so I should probably stop. I've got a whole bunch more I was planning to say. But Maya, do you have any comments or questions you'd like to make?
If you want to finish first, and then we can go to the questions and so on. There are a lot of things that I didn't know, I was not aware about, and I'm grateful that you let us know. So let's finish, because, and you don't have to worry about finishing everything today, because we can continue the conversation later.
Okay. Just a couple really kind of quick points at the end. Obviously, Japan is right now, I'm from about 2017, experiencing a more, a revitalization of media in terms of, what is the role of the media. And it's not, everyone's not on board, obviously. You're seeing a lot of differences between the news outlets, whether they see themselves more as, acting in a more conservative role as, reporters of what the government is putting out in their press releases, versus other news agencies that are tending to be a bit more critical, taking on that watchdog role. But by law, neutrality is the rule. So how that's being implemented, how it's being enforced, is a lot of threats, the use of sort of instigating fights between the news outlets themselves, and then high pressure placed on news ownership. So all of these factors kind of basically leave journalists out to dry for the most part. There's not a lot of support for individual journalists, and the sort of media environment for, a career environment for journalists in Japan is not terribly great. I mean, there's a few other peculiarities about the Japanese system. I mean, for those of you who read newspapers in Japan, you probably notice that bylines are almost never used. And there's a few reasons for that. The main one being that to protect the reporters themselves, as well as the media organization, from lawsuits. But the result of that is, not having any bylines really creates difficulty in creating a name for yourself as a journalism, because no one sees who's writing what stories, or how much any one journalist is writing, or even what field they're writing on. And there are a few other things that create a difficult situation here, and a lot of it is the sort of shaky use of right-wing organizations to sort of follow journalists around, to make death threats, kind of nasty behavior like that that's actually fairly common, apparently. But I did have one last point that I'm going to make, and it's not really a point, it's more a story that I experienced that kind of highlighted to me how the news media actually, through all of this infighting, there's actually still an enormous amount of collaboration between the different news outlets. And ironically enough, the story relates to the assassination of PM Abe. And my calling it an assassination clearly indicates that I am not Japanese. So what happened was, I forget what the exact date was, July 8th or somewhere around there. I was in class that morning teaching, and class on media analysis, funnily enough, in which I actually talk about some of the things that I've been talking about today. And in the middle of class, I get a text from a friend of mine, and I'm talking, and I see the text come up. And normally, of course, when I'm teaching, I don't generally look at my phone. But the friend who texted me, he's a producer at one of Tokyo's major news stations, and I'm not going to mention exactly where, because yes, that wouldn't be good. He's texting me telling me that Abe had just been assassinated. And this was, early, I forget exactly the time, but, when I look back on the timeline, this would have been about 8 minutes after the shots. So he's texting me that Abe had been killed. And he's telling me that, pay attention to the news media, watch how this folds out. And the reason he's sharing this with me is because he knows my interest in like the inner workings of how news is disseminated. And, he's giving me this information basically saying, what's going on and how these decisions are being made. And from the bits of information that I got, what seems to have happened was it was clear to the reporters, at least to him, that Abe had been pretty much immediately killed, although his death wasn't recorded as a death until much later in that evening. But a lot of the information wasn't coming out right away. I mean, there was, of course, immediate news coverage everywhere about, Abe being shot. But a lot of the information was withheld. And what I had told my students, I said, as soon as I got that first text, I'm like, everyone look at your phone right now and wait. Abe has just been shot. Let's see how long this takes. And it took some time, and it took some time, and it took some time. And then finally, everyone's phone started lighting up in the classroom. And it was all coming, through NHK. So NHK is the first organization that was allowed to report. So my friend, obviously not with NHK, was explaining to me that their hands were tied. They had all of this information, but it had been already decided through this kind of, blackboard decision-making that NHK was going to get the scoop. They were the ones who were going to first report it. As soon as NHK reported it, then the other stations would be allowed to start making reports. But what could be contained in the reports and what could not be contained, that was all decided within between these news organizations. So you weren't seeing a lot of difference in reporting from one organization to the next. So it was kind of interesting to me to watch, in real time how this was playing out. And for such a huge major news event that, I can't imagine that any news organization in the United States would give up any scoop or any information that they had on something that huge just for the sake of sort of maintaining good relations between each other. So that kind of surprised me. Anyway, I will end with that story and see if anyone has any comments or questions.
Well, thank you. Great. I mean, there are so many things that I was not aware of, and about the history, of course, of the media and the media relationship with the government here in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
So, it was just fascinating to listen to you, but also I was wondering how this relates to the relationships of the media and governments with in other parts of the world, because we know that, especially in the current geopolitical situation, we know that there is a lot of talk about affiliation of different media outlets. To me, it looks like, for example, in Western countries, the affiliation is more on corporate level. Depending on what corporations sponsor the outlets there. But here it looks like that affiliation is based on political, let's say, political ideas and, of course, self-censoring, and, of course, on which, where on the political spectrum you stand on, I mean, the media outlet. And you mentioned also that it's so difficult for journalists to have a career here, that they're not protected, and that it's very difficult to, or close to impossible to report independently and disclose their own views on what is happening. So, I mean, all these points are just, wow. So, Abe was assassinated, obviously, and then now Takaichi, she is not in the government any longer. Do you think that this trend will continue, or is there anything that will just or reverse it, let's say?
That's really hard to answer. There has been a lot of change over, I'd say the past 15 years or so in certain areas regarding the use of the kishakurab. I know in Nagano they have eliminated a lot of the kishakurab there. There are certain ministries in Tokyo that have changed the relationship or have downsized, or some of them have actually eliminated the kishakurab. So there is movement in that area, and I think that the existence of kishakurab is, the reason why media is sort of the shape that it is and the sort of stalemate that it's at right now. So if there's more motion or more movement in that direction, obviously that's going to make some major changes. And right now, in terms of where do the independent media stand regarding information that is not favorable to the administration, obviously they're not getting the support within their news organizations. They're getting pressured from other news organizations. So you've got this, vertical and horizontal web that they're stuck in. But the one sort of odd saving grace has been the fact that magazines have not been traditionally allowed to be members of the Kisha Club. So a lot of these, like the weekly magazines here in Japan, have played the role of whistleblower. And how that's happening is a lot of the investigative reporting that's being done by, top reporters at, various newspapers here, when their own newspaper won't publish this information or is not able to publish information, they're selling this to the magazines. So these individual reporters then are passing their stories on, their information on to magazine reporters where it finally gets published. Once these more critical pieces are published in weekly magazines, then the major news networks can take on these stories. Now it's out in the open. They're not breaking the story themselves. Of course, the way in which they talk about these stories is going to differ from outlet to outlet, but it's the point of breaking the story, or the one who brings this information to light is the one that's going to bear the brunt of any possible punishment or banishment from these different press clubs. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Yes, it does. And it's, also fascinating to see that there is always a way to work around something that does not allow you to be, to go out there.
Definitely.
Yeah. It's fascinating, even in Japan, because we tend to think that the Japanese society and also the politics here, they're very homogeneous and, well disciplined and so on. But at the end of the day, there is always a way around something. So, wow, great. And I also wonder, because, okay, so my question before you mentioned, you told us about this mechanism, actually, that some of the stories are sold to the magazines, and then it's the magazines that break them out first. And then from there, actually, the national outlets, they can report on them as well. I was going to ask you, how do you see the role of alternative media? And also, when I say alternative media, I mean, like, let's say, alternative media, like social networks as well, because we have seen that, for example, in other parts of the world, when it's difficult to break a story within or in the, let's say, major news outlets, so people go on SNS and they talk about it, they create a movement there and so on. How do you see the role of the alternative media, including the SNS here in Japan?
That's a tricky question.
Okay, sorry for that.
No. There's a lot of kind of unique characteristics of how social media is used in Japan that make how you describe the use of social media in terms of news in the West makes it a little bit different here. And one of the key features, I think, is that the majority of social media use in Japan is done, I don't want to say necessarily anonymously, but people don't often post with their actual names, where we're more likely to do that in the West. So when it comes to like credibility issues, there's a lot of sort of pulling away from the use of social media as sort of legitimate news sources, because it's a little bit harder to trace or to verify things here. But that being said, obviously social media has changed the media landscape. It's opened up leaking of information, if you want to call it leaking, but dissemination of otherwise difficult to publish content. So who's actually doing the dissemination? That's a bit hard to trace here. But again, with the threats of actual jail time, if you're the reporter who is either publishing through a newspaper or posting something on a social media account that is considered under very sketchy descriptions in the State Secrecy Act to be a state secret or confidential information, you're risking a 5-year jail term. So that's one of the reasons why Japanese press freedom is ranked now at 71. Because that basically eliminates anyone in the journalistic fields from wanting to risk their career and their livelihood and risking jail time. But in terms of other people who may have information, I think that fear is so pounded into the heads of journalists here that it's preventing a lot of information from coming out. I think there's a lot of people in the field here have a lot more information that just never sees the light of day. And that's really too bad. I think that, a democracy like Japan would thrive even more with a more free press. But there are people who are outside of the field of journalism who don't necessarily know about these laws or this information, that are a bit more free without that pressure to actually initiate public discourse on certain topics. Whether that actually gets very far in this environment, I think there's a lack of public interest overall in a lot of sort of political and social issues here. So kind of that shikataganai type of approach to, another scandal. We're used to these already. So it's good to have another weapon to use in terms of the use of social media, but it hasn't been that big breakthrough, I think, that people would have anticipated it to be, at least not yet. I'm sure that, there'll be changes at some point.
Right. Well, that's also, an observation that I didn't make before and I was not aware of. So thank you very much for, outlining this for us here. Yuka, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Laurie, for a great, the what do you call this? Great session. I feel like, I took a KO lecture for free. So thank you so very much.
Thank you, Yuka.
So, of course, I'm Japanese, but I didn't know any of those histories. So it was a great lesson for me. But I'm currently I'm in the U.S. and I'm in the financial industry. So I have sort of, this special interest in financial reporting in Japan. So, but if this is not outside of your specialty, so please let me know. But, in the U.S., like, Fed official, like a Federal Reserve Bank official, they're in the quiet period because they're going to announce the rate decision tomorrow. But during this 2 weeks, if they want to communicate to the market, they do so through Wall Street Journal. And a journalist, he sort of shared those information with us on Twitter. Do they have similar, like a custom in Japan, like a Nikkei does that kind of reporting?
Yeah, I'm not exactly informed on that, but I know that in terms of, the finance ministry, Nikkei, of course, is a member of the press club there and is probably the most close to the officials in that organization. So like earlier I mentioned, certain practices of, visiting with the ministry officials, morning and evening for, getting that one-on-one FaceTime. So I'm sure that a majority of that one-on-one time is given primarily to Nikkei, and Nikkei is very positive in terms of the current administration and reporting on that. So I'm sure that they do get preferential treatment. And then what they're doing with that information, whether or not Nikkei is actively posting through Twitter, that's something I don't know. I don't follow their account. So.
Okay, great, though. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, what were you thinking about telling us that you made? This is like a to be continued to the next session. I'm sorry, yeah, but I'm so curious.
No, I ended up just kind of focusing on the media industry, but actually, my work or my interests are not so much with news media or media industry. I'm interested, or what I do is, as I said earlier at the beginning, I'm interested in social change and how. Culture and social values are shaped through the media. So I look a lot more at specific social issues, for example, women in the workplace or attitudes towards LGBTQ community or things like that, and then how the media are actively shaping those. And so looking at this media environment and what does that mean for these social issues? Like, what is the government's agenda regarding some of these social issues? How are they talking to the media outlets about these? And then how is the media using that information to inform their production of television shows that may be incorporating these issues in them? And then you can see quite a bit of diversity between different news stations and how they approach similar social issues. So that was kind of not what I was going to be talking about today, but that's sort of my general direction or my interest.
So, okay, that would be maybe next 2-3 sessions, right? Anyway, and then you also earlier on, sorry, Tami-san, briefly, you mentioned that, you teach in your classroom, there are many, the students who are back from, studying abroad. And then you have noticed the differences between their perceptions or their thinking, with them. And so maybe in the future, if you could, share with us the differences, that would be very interesting to me. Thank you.
Certainly.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to agree with Yuka and say that, I think we could have a lot more sessions, assuming, Laurie, you'd be willing to come again, because there's so many directions we could go. And I just have one comment. It's not something we can get into today, but it kind of, maybe a future discussion is, it's kind of an unspoken thing, but the level of trust that exists or doesn't exist in the media. And I've seen in my own country the level of trust break down across the spectrum, left, right, every political affiliation. Nobody trusts, the corporate media, the cable news, and so because of that, and you kind of answered the question that Maya asked, is maybe you don't see the same alternative media that you do, for example, in the U.S. So my impression has been traditionally that especially the elder generation, my mother-in-law, they completely, everything they hear on the news, that's gospel. They trust it. And I'm curious in the future to maybe talk about, has that trust eroded with the younger generations or other people, at large, as much as it has in the U.S., or do people still trust the media here? Again, we don't have to go into it today because we're running out of time, but that's kind of what was.
Yeah, no, it's a very short answer. Yes, it's quite generational here. I know with older generations, media, especially television, is I forget this. There's a statistic I read recently where I think in Japan, the older generation, like 65 and above, record about 7 hours of television consumption a day, which in this day and age is pretty massive. But yeah, this belief that what they see on television, the news that they see on television, that's pretty much gospel. And then when you break it down generationally, you do see an erosion in that. But current generation, current being like anyone from about 25 and under, has very little experience with traditional television broadcast media. So if you ask them whether or not they trust, they'd be like, what? what do you mean TV media? What is that? So it's a bit different. But yeah, much longer discussion for sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. Anyway, really interesting. I know it's past 9, so Maya, did you want to take us home?
Okay, so it's Wednesday. It's the first day of the Golden Week for some. For others, it is the middle of the Golden Week already. Thank you very much, Laurie. This was really a fascinating session, and I'm very grateful that you agreed to be our guest speaker today. I am very much looking forward to continuing this topic with you. It was a pleasure having you here. This was Japan Expert Insights. Stay with us, keep informed, and that's it.